Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session will now begin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first plenary session of the day. Please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, Global Affairs Analyst at CNN, Kimberly Dozier.
Lovely to see so many people out bright and early in Rabat at the home of the Policy Center. I would like to introduce my panel first. Joining us on stage, we have Ambassador Omar Hilal. He is the permanent representative of Morocco to the United Nations. And next, we have Minister Erika Moines. She is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Panama. About there.
Great.
And then we have Minister Ana Palacio, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Spain. And last, we have Professor Jacques Attali, President of Attali Associates. Now, as we settle ourselves, we're just going to watch a quick video from the Policy Center.
Southfullness, a concept increasingly debated in international forums, challenges the idea of the West as a unified and influential bloc. Today, the West often appears out of step with the world's fast-paced developments, struggling to drive the global agenda and losing ground to emerging powers. It faces an existential crisis, lacking a clear purpose. Meanwhile, the South is gaining concretely gain a greater role in global governance. What would more Southfullness imply for global governance? How can South-South coordination and cooperation be enhanced? For what results?
So, with those overarching questions, I must first apologize that I brought something here with me from the West. I got a cold a couple of weeks ago at Chatham House in Berlin. So with apologies for my hoarse voice, this session is riffing off of the theme from the Munich Security Conference in 2020, which was called Westlessness, where it was trying to describe how Western alliances and Western bodies were not as useful as they seem to have been before. This was somewhat provoked by the Trump administration then. That was February 2020, and nobody knew that Biden was going to win that fall. The Trump administration had questioned the value of alliances. People who briefed President Trump tell me that he would question them behind closed doors in the Oval Office. Tell me the concrete value of some of these alliances. Tell me what NATO has gained for us. Bringing fresh eyes to the question of don't just say the names of these things, let's ask them to give back what we are giving to them. So it was a bit of introspection, and we're going to kick off from that introspection to look at, okay, that's Westlessness, or what's happening in the West, but what is Southfullness? Now, I heard in some of the panels yesterday, they were trying to grapple with what does it mean, culturally, to be a cultural ambassador with Southern culture to the rest of the world. What I'm going to ask all of my panelists is a lightning round question of, okay, you've got someone from someone in their 20s who, yeah, they've heard the word NATO, they've heard of the BRICS, but they don't know what the word Southfullness means. So you've got a smart young 20-year-old, perhaps at this Polytechnic University. I'm going to start with our host country. Ambassador, give us your elevator speech. Remember, this generation, they're always on their phones, so they have a very short attention span. So tell them very briefly what Southfullness means.
Si vous permettez, je vais répondre en français.
He wanted to challenge me to get back at the fact that I wouldn't give them the question beforehand.
That's the surprising reaction. Génération. Et on doit être franc avec la génération présente et future. Le Sud.
There is not a single South. The South is plural, which is why we talk about global South. There is the South related to the BRICS, as well as the South representing emerging nations. There are also southern countries which are isolated islands and other emerging nations which are fighting against difficult challenges, particularly related to climate change challenges. And we have already started to speak about ways to protect their sovereignty and their core governmental institutions. There are also other states which finance terrorism, separatism, and fuel wars and greater tensions in various regions. But amongst this plurality of various components within the word South, there is hope, because the South represents about 85% of the world's population and over 50% of the world's GDP. The South, as we perceive it, or as we wish to perceive it, should be encouraged to protect national sovereignty, dialogue, and also foster greater inclusivity, because the current world we're living in, we can be witness in this world to growing inequalities and economic disparities, various disparities which are present in the South, as well as the persistence of armed conflicts. About 56 armed conflicts, and from these 56 armed conflicts that we currently are witness to around the world, 54 are located in the South. The UN Security Council's agenda contains in its majority wars related to southern nations, but the South also presents political power. Even if it is not a bloc which is economically dominant across the world, it holds a lot of political power. There is an emergence of ideology, and the South as a region has a lot to bring to the table. Various benefits to having the South involved in international organizations. The South also can be perceived as a space where we can foster greater solidarity. We also talk about the exploitation of different materials and minerals, for example, which are overwhelmingly present in the southern region. And we can consider the South as a resource-rich region. But this is all conditional on having laws and an equitable and fair treatment of countries of the South, particularly when it comes to global affairs, and an acceptance of the South's contribution on an equal footing as the North and northern countries, a major part. I
mean, you're invited to most of the fora. You're part of lots of international bodies. What more needs to happen to indicate acceptance of the South point of view?
I think from our part in South, there is this there is this desire to contribute, to participate to the management of international relationships and to settle problems. But in the North, I think there is a fear that the South is doing or behaving in a manner to replace the North or to be more influential. I don't think that the South would like to change the world. I don't think that the South would like to take the place in the North, in the international governance. What the South is looking for is, as I said, more equity, more inclusivity, and more participation at equal level, either in the Security Council or in the financial international institutions or regionally, because the South sometimes doesn't have the leverage to settle its own problems, either economic problems or political problems, because of the ingerence or interference.
So one of the ways that fear of Southern power is articulated is that there isn't enough Southern representation, for instance, at the Security Council, on the Permanent Security Council?
We are looking for that.
Yeah.
There is an injustice that is done to Africa.
So that's a concrete way that they could prove it.
That's the concrete way. But unfortunately, up to now, the last reform of the Security Council is already 60 years. And we are still discussing the manner to reform and to accept the new members.
Right.
Unfortunately, and here, the different perceptions. Now, the North is trying to find solution to accept the membership of their own candidates from the North. But when it comes to the South, there is discussions.
I love concrete examples of things people could do to represent and to show that they're bringing the South into things. So, Minister Moines, the ambassador laid out both some positives and some negatives. On the positive side, resource rich, with mineral wealth especially. The South has 85% of the population and roughly 50% of the GDP, and that translates into political power. But he also mentioned of the 56 global armed conflicts, 54 are in the South. So how would you explain Southfullness to someone who's in their 20s with a short attention span and perhaps make it sound positive?
Well, I would avoid more terms. I think Southfullness in itself wouldn't catch the attention of a 20-year-old. It would be too much. It's a mouthful. So
doesn't fit with the meme generation.
No, but I think the idea behind it, it's to me more interesting and more positive, which is I think 20-year-olds relate with the idea that the current platform architecture of the systems, the norms that we follow in the international arena are not fair, are not equitable. Any 20-year-old can relate to that, and the idea and the hope and the positive behind the rise of the South. So anything that is coming up and bringing in less sort of the status quo, and we can, we just talked about the Security Council, but it could be the WHO and what happened with the pandemic and how the vaccines never got where they should have on timely basis. The WTO, I mean,
You mean they never got where they should have in the South on a timely basis?
Yes, absolutely. And the numbers are there, but I think 20-year-olds relate to the idea how long it took for the Caribbean, for Africa to get to get, while other countries had 8 times reserve, 10 times reserve, just waiting them and not using them. So the idea that the time is prime for disruption and for newer and more equitable, I think is super interesting, super positive, and could catch the attention beyond a new term or debating whether the term is helpful or not, or inclusive or not. I think it's more helpful to focus on the idea and get more young people involved or interested, and the best way to connect is to connect. And here there's a program of young leaders, and I think we do little on thinking that for younger generations to be more humane and more equitable in thinking about more of the actual cooperation, they need to talk among themselves. So you can't continue having one generation on one side, and you mentioned the South-to-South cooperation. Latin America and Africa rarely connect at a younger base, at a younger level, studying together, working together, and that's a way to actually make those connections real and for, setting up this framework that I'm referring to in terms of the international norms that needs revision desperately in all forms. Even the International Court of Justice, wherever you go, it's time.
Now, there was a wonderful panel last night on how culture can lead and be an ambassador for foreign policy. How would you perhaps use culture to connect, or sports to connect the youth of those different populations?
Well, I think that there is, first you cut the dependency from the North. And that everything that comes from the North is the good part, and we forget how interesting, how wonderful it is, the identity and that sort of same parallel. So cutting the dependency, and that starts with us.
So get rid of the McDonald's and the Starbucks. What is the Panama coffee chain that we should have here in Morocco?
Yes, that's absolutely, and it's interesting. I think, again, we're all, I think, exhausted from the same things that we've been told, that we've been digesting in terms of content, in terms of everything that we consider great and wonderful. So this newer generation is actually more interested in this exoticness of beyond the McDonald's and beyond the Starbucks. And this is where we can all help and create and foster that environment so there starts a more direct exchange of ideas. And we have one wonderful tool that did not exist a couple decades ago, and that's the internet. And yes, it has its negative, but it also has the positive. You don't need to be person to person in order for those ideas to exchange and that content to go from one side to the other. So it's a wonderful platform for that exchange to take place.
So, Minister Palacio has asked to go last. But you also wrote a wonderful paper for the Policy Center. So you essentially wrote the paper on it. So I'm going to go to Professor Attali next. How would you, since you spend a lot of your time thinking about the future, you are a futurist, what frame do you see for Southfullness going forward?
Je vais suivre l'exemple de l'ambassadeur et parler français.
Ambassador's example and speak in French. The term of Southfullness is anachronic. It is a term which does not apply today and is outdated. With the unaligned group, this dating from the 1950s. Excuse me, I would like to just pursue my thought. Indeed, it is a outdated world. I do maintain that argument. What remains from this term is former colonized nations, which form some unity. But we obviously do not count certain self-proclaimed nations, self-proclaimed southern nations like Russia. As the ambassador has explained, there is a plurality in the South, something that we can also consider. We can find North in the South. We can find elitism in the South. There are populations in northern countries that also struggle just as much as some in the South. But my main point is having countries which are autocratic and totalitarian. And what we can link back to this rapport between the North and the South is that the American empire is declining, but they do remain, the states do remain, a global superpower. It is similar to what happened with the decline of the Roman Empire. When I speak of the future, it's very important to look back at the history and the past. When the Roman Empire started declining, it was still a major world power and empire, the most powerful. And what happened at that time? Everyone was living like Romans. The barbarians, which were not actually barbarians, were also living the Roman way and adopted the Roman faith. And this is what happens today. The South is replicating the way of life of the norm, of the North. The West is declining, but the world has been imprinted with the Western model. Individualism, which was born in various ways in India, in Africa, and across thinkers, Judeo-Greek thinkers, we can see that individualism is today the new way of life and the norm. The West has won and imposed. It's really between those who have joined democratic regimes and those who haven't. That is where the line lies. You have southern democracies. Are we heading towards dark times, or are we heading towards something else? Where are we heading? Are we going to see greater individualism within humanity? I am from those who think that democracy will prevail.
With considerable changes,
With
because of course
major
it's not reasonable, of course, to
changes.
treat
It's
the
not
Indian
normal
democracy as a
to
sub-country,
consider
whereas
or
of course,
treat
which is not, of
the
course,
Indian
having
democracy as a
permanent
minority when
seat
it
at
is
the
one
United
of the
Nations
most
is
populated
absurdity.
countries
No,
in the
but
world.
as far as I'm concerned, the real distinction, the real barometer, is the distinction between democracy, dictatorship, and countries transiting either one or the other side. Bon, ceci étant dit,
Minister Palacio. Now, you wrote a paper for the Policy Center, The Atlantic, in parentheses, Global South in the Geopolitical Whirlwind, where you kind of went into a lot of the history of this term. So how would you describe it? And also, I want everyone to pick up your apps and just as Minister Palacio is talking, I have a word cloud discussion question, how you see Southfullness in one word. So if you all, the organizers, can show that on the screen. And now, Anna, over to you.
Bueno, yo quiero empezar dando las gracias al Policy Center.
Thanking the Policy Center for having included Spanish as one of the languages of this conference. I think this is the right thing to do with this idea of the Atlantic. I think there are many Latin American participants in this conference, and I think that this was the right choice. We need to foster this idea of belonging to the Atlantic Basin, both North and South. And obviously, this shows the vision and how smart the university and the Policy Center is by including Spanish in the conference. However, I will not be speaking Spanish. I will just switch to French or English.
Just addressing this youngster, I think that the question, and I fully agree with both Ambassador Filali and Professor, and my paper just takes from a different perspective, but exactly the same thing. I think for the South, it's about agency. If I had to explain to a youngster what is the challenge, it's about agency. And you have highlighted that this youngster will have his cell phone with him. And I think that this agency for the new generation has to be channeled through training. I think that we have to rethink, and this university is starting to rethink, this idea of the classical training, which will happen, the university as we have known it, but there is a challenge, especially in Africa, because of demographics. Yesterday we had some interesting comments on the fact that Africa is the burgeoning continent until the 50s. And after the 50s, humanity itself will have a problem of degrowth or not growing, or which is different. So, for me, I will tell him it's about agency. It's about what we would call today informal training based on the new technologies, and it's happening. OCP is a good example of having launched, and the university, I think, is going to pick up. Now, to complement what has been said, okay, well, I would say I fully agree with Filali, I fully agree with what has been said, but I want to highlight another issue. You are absolutely right in highlighting that it's about the perceived relative decline of United States. That's clear. But we have gone into a spiral of self-deprecation in the West that is not helpful. In other terms, it's not helpful. I think that this is what I would tell, and I told them in the Munich Security Westlessness. I mean, come on, Westlessness. It's
you mean the West has gone into a spiral of self-deprecation?
Yeah, of self-deprecation. Absolutely, yes. Especially we Europeans. We have to see what the role, and there is a role for us in the future. And I will go again to the Atlantic, because on this I partially disagree with you in the sense that I think that the divide is democracies, autocracies, but with a big gray in between, a big gray. I would say that the gray is overwhelming today, but it's the individual against the group. Or we have at one extreme the liberal democracies highlighting the individual, at the other extreme culture and civilization like China, but others that highlight the group. And I think that this is the big challenge. All our multilateral system is, in the end, based on the value of the individual. If some of you have read the memoirs of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt was the head of the American delegation to the debate of the Declaration of Human Rights in 1947, at a certain moment she says, and Mr. Chan, or Professor Chan, was the Chinese representative. Of course, it was Chiang Kai-shek's representative, but was very cross and said, you know what? Your administration should learn Confucianism because of the importance of the group in this context. So I think that this is the big debate, and I think that in the Atlantic, we fully value the individual more than in other cultures in Asia that highlight more, and this is, I fully agree that this is confusion. So this is my first comment. My second comment is that I fully agree that in this self-deprecation, we tend to see that the South, and there is no South, you are absolutely right, there are many South, but that there is a tendency of scruton the rest of the West being united just by opposition to the West. And honestly, when you go inside, and I fully agree that Russia cannot just claim to be South. They are not South in any respect. Even China, it's very difficult to see China as the South. But I think that the South is hedging. I mean, countries all over the world are hedging because they have different possibilities. As a former world banker, and I was there, General Counsel of the group, I have seen how many times we were confronted with the fact that, okay, you have too many conditions, and this we could discuss why we have this conditionality. We have China that will do the same, will not ask questions. And today it's not just China, it's India, it's Turkey. So what we have to understand is that today I think almost any country in the list, except a few, two categories of the list that you have very rightly exposed, has choices, and that they don't feel that it's like during the Cold War, either with the free world or with the communist world. And there are regions and there are areas where you see that in history. And one is here in Morocco. Morocco, the relations of Morocco with Algeria just are a translation of all this historically. So I'm positive. There is one last comment that I want to do. In our north, there are many pundits that say, finish the rules. There is no space for the rules. Rules is doomed. I think that it's very important that the Moroccan permanent representative to United Nations that sees that in direct contact every day just has supported this idea that, of course, there is a role for rules. These rules have to change, have to be more inclusive, have to be reformed. And when I say rules, I say institutions. And you have asked about the Security Council. I can tell you, the Bretton Woods institution is not just about having another African as a concession on the board of the World Bank. No, it's changing, completely changing the approach of these institutions. But there is a future. I think that there is this old world, and there is a new world where the West, Europe, just a parenthesis, I think that there is much more in common and agency in the G7 than in the BRICS. The BRICS have nothing to do one with the other. It's just by opposition to the G7. Even the G20 has an interest for other reasons, but I will leave it there, because if you let me, I will speak.
Well, so if we could bring up the word cloud again, just to sum up some of the things that Minister Palacio said. You think Westlessness equals a spiral of self-deprecation, but that it does acknowledge the fall or the decline of the United States, which Professor Attali brought up as well. But you have this interesting frame of adding Atlanticness to Southfullness, which can equal the values of the individual, and that there's this big gray area of individuals against a group, which is somewhere between democracies and autocracies. So those are some of the things that fit into the definition. Now we see our audience is divided. Some of the biggest words are nothing. Southfullness means nothing, or it means revolution. And then a word that's getting a lot more votes is woke. So you're dismissing us as being woke for even discussing the concept at all. If it means revolution, Ambassador, what does that revolution look like? Let's launch on the subject of COP29. Now, COP29 did come up with a compromise where $300 billion would be invested annually by 2035 to provide global finance to help less wealthy countries develop clean economies and cope with damage. But independent economists say you actually need more like 1.3 trillion annually. And we all saw what happened with the largely southern islands that ended up walking out and really couldn't get what they needed. So let's talk about a practical approach to increase the volume or increase, how do you make the South more powerful diplomatically so that this doesn't keep happening?
Let's go back to COP29. They call it a technical COP because all the discussion was how money we can collect to help the South or countries who are suffering from the climate change. And you explain it very well by saying that, unfortunately, what the agreement of 300 billion are not meeting the expectations of the developing countries, especially the Pacific Islands. That's why they walked out from the meeting. And I think that's kind of revolution. They said, no, we cannot accept what you are proposing because it's not fair, and we are suffering from your pollution. Because when you see the volume of pollution in the north and the south, who are the emitter of carbon. So there is a revolution in asking more justice, more equality, reducing inequality, and more respect for the rules. I think there was a call for respecting the rules. And when we see the state of the world, we realize, unfortunately, that rules are not respected anymore, especially by, when I say anymore, I'm so sorry, I'm a little bit extreme, but I see in the UN daily what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Ukraine reflects that even big powers are not respecting anymore the rules. And people or states are asking, where is the UN? UN is a victim of what's happening because the rules are not respected. But despite that, there is hopes because the developing country or the global south is pushing to force the other countries to sit, to discuss, and to find compromises. And I will give you one example. Just recently, we adopted in New York the Pact of the Future. It was discussed during months and months. And in the final day, the West, I would not say the North, the West didn't want to accept some paragraphs. And also, not only the West, the East means another big power in the East. But the Global South imposed that the position, because since we are discussing how we can build a better future for the next generation, and we win there. I mean, when we win, we are talking about the Global South. Another example for the veto, which is weakening the Security Council mission and the responsibility to protect peace and security. 3 years ago, thanks to the General Assembly and thanks to the Global South, we managed to adopt a resolution that forces, whenever there is a veto, the issue goes to the General Assembly, and the country who used the veto is obliged to explain why. And, that's, it's kind of, the General Assembly is just taking some powers from the Security Council, but it's only moral power, only political power. They cannot impose any kind of resolutions. That's why there was a resolution on Ukraine, there was a resolution on ceasefire on Gaza, and also in other issues. So there is a revolution, but a revolution for more equitable world. But in the same times, and I would like just to go back to the word you said that people here are divided. Nothing. We go back to the perception of the South is not very clear. There is so many South that it's very difficult to position itself with which South. Does this South, kind of this 5 or 6 South represent me or not? Can I be with them or not? Even for the BRICS, the BRICS is something from the South. And the South is the one who is asking for respecting less using the veto. But the BRICS is using the veto among themselves to prevent the adhesion of new members. You see, what they are denouncing in New York, they are just approving it in Pretoria or in Moscow or other country.
And so it'll be market power that determines who really moves forward.
Unfortunately.
Minister Moines, just riffing off of that, I'm thinking about how President-elect Trump has talked about putting tariffs on everyone outside of the U.S. Panama gets a lot of its GDP, of course, from the Panama Canal, the traffic. So any impact on trade will impact you. But where I'm going with this is I'm thinking of things like the Organization of American States and wondering if there's a way of Latin American countries or Latin American and African countries binding together to fight against a trade war of some sort. Can these southern bodies be useful in rounding people up to be as powerful in their cooperation as some of these West-based cooperative networks?
So I think there are several distinct
Yeah, I went several
elements.
directions there. I'm just going to let you pick what you want out of it.
Okay, so tariffs, yes, it's the new word for everything and the solution apparently for everything, whether that will pan out or not. I think there's several skeptics, including myself, that it will actually work in the long term, given what's happened in the past. However, the threat is looming. The most immediate neighbor, Mexico and Canada, already gotten sort of the soft threats of it. I think it is forgotten the power that each of those countries have. Mexico, for starters, the buying power is the number one purchaser of goods of the U.S. So you have to stand on your ground and sort of also recognize or establish this is me, and I'm not going to be bullied by another country. I think that's important. More generally, when you're speaking about all Latin American countries, I don't think that there's an existing threat of tariffs for the broader Latin America. If that were the case, I do think that the countries can unite themselves in fighting any country. Whether they do it or not, that's a different story, because we have not been great at uniting ourselves. We have several platforms that have not played out as they should have. But the time, as I was saying before, what's happened in the past has led us to a point where it's ready and ripe for disruption in terms of how things have been carried out. So I am very hopeful of how, on a principle basis, because I think, and you started talking about alliances and whether they were useful or not. Typically, alliances that are based on principles last a really long time, and those that are out of convenience or in a point in time tend to disappear very quickly. So I think that there is a possibility, because most Latin American countries shared principles, and those values and principles unite us more than sort of the political spectrum that is very different amongst Latin American countries. The general, more broader point that you raised of whether the canal would be affected by potentially tariffs and trade, there is a movement already happening, which is economic nationalism, and I wrote about it, where most powers, and this is not only the U.S., China has done it. I mean, several of the big powers have recognized that against the globalization, it is better to invest locally, even if for the economy, the net effect is not positive, because it generates workforce, it creates employment, it's very popular, you're creating for your own. So this economic nationalism is forcing a lot of countries to look inwards, even if it's not economically beneficial. And unfortunately, you don't have the consumer groups going out and being the loudest voices in all those Congress. What you see are the interest groups, the farming that may be affected. Those are the ones who lobby in each of the countries to say, we want less trade and we want more sort of inwards and more investment locally, even if it's not the ideal or the most positive for the economy. So that's a general trend, and you can see in terms of trade how that's affecting. Now, for the Panama Canal directly, we have plenty, we have more than what we can even manage. So I don't think that would be a direct concern for us. I would be more concerned, and this is going to your point on the COP, we are suffering from climate change and going on whether the allocation is fair or not is definitely not fair. The COP has become, to a certain extent, a great photo op for presidents and statesmen around the world to say that they're collaborating. But without the enforcement mechanism, other than a beautiful picture of many flags, it doesn't translate into the actual dollar value that is needed or the money that is required in each of these countries, including myself, and including my own country. Panama is one of the only 3 countries in the world certified to be carbon negative. So we emit less carbon than the one that we take on. And we get $0 from this fund. We get zero. Now we have the Panama Canal, and going to the point, we need to expand. It's going to be on the order of $1 billion. We're not going to get any money from outside. We have to fund essentially our own bill. So there is a lot of frustration, and continuing on the path of let's try on out of the goodwill is not going to do any good, because without the enforcement mechanism, it doesn't translate into action.
Now would like to take a vote in the audience before we turn to audience questions, and I pull our other panelists in. Bilal and team, I know I'm giving you a real challenge since I was going to lead with the vote, but if you go to your app, the choices I've offered you are, does the current inner turmoil in the West present an opportunity for the South, an opportunity for China and Russia, a worrying loss of Western focus, or all of the above? So as we wait for the vote, Professor Attali, how would you answer that question?
I don't understand the question.
So in terms of the inner turmoil in the West, is it an opportunity for the South to expand on its own goals, hopes, dreams, plans? Or if you have the West not investing as prominently as it used to, but you have China and Russia making major inroads diplomatically and economically, is that an opportunity for them?
Yes, but as I said, that the South is meaningless, I would not answer to the question which is meaningless to me. Therefore, I would say it's clear that today we see an increasing influence of China in Africa and Russia in Africa, that's for sure. But this is China and Russia, this is not the South as a whole. As I said, I don't believe in this concept. It's the influence of totalitarian regimes on countries and on governments which are also totalitarian or fascinated by totalitarian regimes. And in my view, if you look at long-term history of mankind, totalitarianism is a disaster for mankind. There is no solution. Even if in today people say, well, autocracy are better for environment, for taking unpopular decisions, I don't think it's true. It's not true. Democracy is the worst but the best system. And therefore, I think it's really the line of divide that we must have in mind.
Which are the totalitarian regimes that you think are taking advantage of
Russia and China?
And you think they're taking advantage of Africa and Latin America?
Yeah, they are taking advantage of. Why do they do that? They do that as the Europeans did in the past, to take raw materials out of it. If you see what China is doing in Democratic Republic of Congo, it's not a political influence. It's to take the raw materials from the country and use it for their own benefit. It's purely an economic fight. I don't think it is in the interest of Africa to have Russia and China more influential. I think what is important is for them to build institutions. Of course, it's true, and what you said about the last COP demonstrates that there is a line of divide between people who can pay and people who cannot pay, and we saw that again. But this division is also true. There is a division between who can pay. China can pay, and China doesn't pay. But China, is it part of North or South?
Yeah.
China decided not to pay the 1.3 trillion.
Well, it's still considered a developing country, isn't it?
It's a shame. Then it's nothing to do with North and South.
Well, our answers looks like not many people are worried about a loss of Western focus. Yes, it's an opportunity for the South and for China and Russia, but most people think it's all of the above. So with that, I'm going to go to questions, and probably one of the first ones. Let's see, I'm going to take a couple here, and here in this panel, and then is there anyone behind me? I've been giving you my back this whole time. So if you could keep your questions brief. The mic runners, we have in the front row right here, this gentleman, and then this lady and this gentleman.
Thank you. For all the panelists, I get the impression that we're having a debate at two different levels. Part of it is on form, in other words, what you call it, and part of it is on substance. So I want to ask sounds like a trivial kind of making fun question. If I fight with my wife, does it mean that I'm looking for another woman?
Good question. Okay. And sorry. And did you introduce yourself?
Question.
Sir, did you introduce yourself?
Nkosana Moyo. I run a think tank called the Mandela Institute for Development Studies.
Okay, that's a good question. And then from you, the lady in the vest.
Thank you very much. My name is Asma. I'm an economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. So my question would be for Monsieur Jacques Attali about what he thinks about the role of multi-development bank now, because also Monsieur l'Ambassadeur pointed that also the pressure as well. Do you think now with the BRICS bank, etc., do you think there is a threat for the work of the multi-development bank and the pressure they get actually from their shareholder to not invest in certain country? How do you see that actually?
Okay. And then one more. Oh, did you introduce yourself?
My name is Asma. I'm an economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Yes, thank you.
Mon nom est Ali Ben Yahya, doctorant en économie à l'UM6P.
At UM6P, it's not really a question, but you've extensively discussed youth, 20-year-olds, and naturally I was struck because I am part of that age bracket. If I may, I'd like to share the point of view of a 20-something-year-old from the South. Even if I am a French Moroccan, ladies and gentlemen, I can very candidly tell you that I do not want for the South to be the North of tomorrow. I would be absolutely mortified to see the Kingdom of Morocco transmuting into a new Western world with all of the plights that this model, this civilizational model, is breeding, as we can see unfolding today.
That you want to see.
Alors, justement, j'ai vécu un certain temps
So I've lived in France for about a decade, and I witnessed a real identity crisis, and consumerism is becoming an end in and of itself. I see social media that is gaining lots of ground. I mean, especially in young people's mindsets.
People want to ask questions. So
comprends.
Just briefly.
Mais vraiment parce que vous avez beaucoup.
So you've extensively spoken about youth. So I wanted to share the perspective of a young person.
Et je suis certain que.
And I am sure that the honorable panelists would be intrigued by this point of view that I am sharing. Please feel free to interrupt me if that's not the case. But I simply would like to share that for my future, in fact, for the future of the children, my unborn children, for the South to be a point of a real civilizational disruption for the world. And I hope that we can go towards a civilization that can elevate us. Because, to be honest, if we were to see if you were to meet is an example, or meet somebody from the West, and if you have dinner with them, and if you ask them at the end of the meal or whatnot, are you happy? Do you feel complete? Well, they'll probably break down in tears in front of you.
Basically, sir, I'll get to you in a moment. Why don't we start with, if you're fighting with your wife, does that mean you want a divorce? No, sorry, say again.
If I'm fighting with my wife, does it mean I want another woman?
Okay, sorry. Important. Professor Attali.
My answer to that, if you are fighting with your wife, is your wife looking for another man?
No, I mean,
Minister Palacios.
frankly, I think probably if you are fighting with your wife is that there is something to rebalance in your couple. And this is what you will be discussing, which I think is a great image. And if you don't have a copyright, I'm going to use it.
I guess if you're fighting with your wife, then, is this the marital therapy that we're going through right now? So, Ambassador, about the investment, the bank that you were asking about.
Non, c'était pour moi.
C'était, oui,
C'était
voilà, oui,
pour,
parce qu'il a été le boss.
Ouais.
Il a été le grand boss.
He was actually the leader of the bank.
I think the question was for me. And when we founded this institution, we put something very specific, which never exists in another institution, which is the democratic conditionality to any operation. I will not comment on what is happening today, but I think this should have been the rule for every international institution. No funding without helping transition to democracy. The world would be totally different if it was implemented.
And if you allow me one sentence,
yes.
This is the Articles of Agreement of the bank. So it's the framework, the constitution of the bank. And as a former General Counsel of the World Bank Group, this we don't have. This is the difference of a European sponsor at the end of the 20s, after the end of the Cold War, versus the Bretton Woods institutions. And I fully agree with Professor Attali. This was une grande première, and we have to fight for this kind of inclusions of framework, even if it's not always well followed, but it's a kind of safeguard.
Oh. So we have one question here, and then we had a couple of...
I'm sorry, but I would like to answer to the young man. When he said he's young, but I don't know if he's as young as he said.
We need a young.
Sure.
Yes.
Nobody's perfect. You're right to say that. Vous avez raison.
So you're right in saying that it is extremely frustrating to see the world unfolding as it is today, and you're also right to say that we're all trying to seek a sort of this utopia in this consumer society that is destroying humanity, the environment, that is also self-sabotaging and destroying our identity. But I'm not sure whether the South is the only place where we will try to find that answer. I mean, we need to find that answer everywhere. I mean, we all seek a better world, a different world. It's the only prerequisite or the criteria for humanity's survival. Obviously, in this type of, I think that what we're witnessing today is the economy of death to the economy of life, which needs to contain a sort of a radical shift towards a new development model. I mean, whether it's going to happen in a totalitarian or democratic way, it will happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, humanity will disappear.
And let's see, I had a question here. If you could introduce yourself.
Je voudrais revenir, si vous permettez, à cette dualité que M. Attali a proposée.
If I may, I'd like to comment this democracy or the comment that Mr. Attali said before. he actually kind of nuanced the issue of democracy by highlighting that India is a democracy in its own way. And they chose the way they want to be a democracy. And as the ambassador said, the Global South is plural. And in this plurality, there are several levels of democracy. And I would say even different natures of democracy. And it's up to the West to acknowledge these different natures and styles of democracy. In other words, this plural Global South can trigger and lead to the emergence of several expressions and sensitivities and different alignments in relation with this new polarity, China and the United States. Pourriez-vous
introduce yourself?
Ça va. Comment?
Quel est votre...
Je me présente.
Oui.
Walalou du Policy.
I am Mr. Walalou from the Policy Center, former minister. Well, as you know, democracy is considered as the Western source, the Western concept, but this is not true. India used to be, and it has been recognized as a source of inspiring democracy, and it was also demonstrated and proven that in Africa it was found the source of true and authentic democracy. Democracy is not a Western source or source in the West, so the West cannot be just the only democracy, cannot only be the creed of the West. Of course, democracy is making its baby steps and sometimes stumbling in France, in other parts of the world. This being said, totalitarianism is a barbarian act. And democracy, this is the only way that will allow the world to reach its human dimension. I think we should not make an alliance of the North between the South and the North, and the South and the North, or against the North and the South, but we need to all stand against totalitarianism. Bush used to use democracy to actually hide the North behind the democracy. But if when we have achieved a real notion of democracy towards the South, it is absolutely a great achievement. And this is what Morocco is doing with its neighbors. Thank you.
So, Mr. Attali, I listened to you just now, and you said that Southfullness is meaningless. And could you explain to me why it's meaningless? Is it because there is no communication policy framed around it? And if there is communication policy framed around Southfullness, will it be more meaningful? Thank you.
And could you introduce yourself?
My name is Maureen Chibo. I publish Real News Magazine online, based in Nigeria.
Based in Nigeria. For me, there is no... I explained that, and we all agree, I think, that there are so many different South that you cannot have one concept of South. What is common between Nigeria and China? I don't see anything. China is rich, China is a dictatorship, Nigeria is going in direction of democracy. I wouldn't say it's a full democracy, nobody is. And therefore there is nothing in common, no common interests. There may be more common interest between Nigeria and Brazil than between Nigeria and China. Therefore, I don't think this is a useful and operational concept. South is not an operational concept.
Ma'am.
I'm Mampila Rampili. I am from South Africa. I'm a former co-president of the Club of Rome. I'm concerned about the characterization of individuality versus communality only in terms of Asia versus Western countries. I come from the cradle of humanity, where all of you come from. And the human beings well, it doesn't matter which political ideology you have, human beings are essentially relational they cannot, a baby cannot survive except through the support of others, which is why they can never be, in terms of African philosophy, a me without a we. So that's the first thing. The second point which concerns me is the South, or Southfullness, as is defined by some of the speakers here, as like the language of emerging markets. Emerging from where to where? And that suggests that the West is the standard against which or everything else has to be measured. That, I think, is exactly what brought us to this polycrisis. Because the way of life that the West adopted post the Industrial Revolution is not sustainable. And the educational system we are using is equally inspired by that Industrial Revolution. So I would like us to be more open, and I think this is what's exciting about Morocco and its exploration of ways of being that's different from the current traditional way of doing things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a good point that a lot of our language, what's left over, is vestiges of colonialism. And I have to say, as a member of the West or the North, I don't feel comfortable telling people in the South that Southfullness doesn't apply when it's something that someone in the South told me is something that is meaningful to them.
I mean, sorry,
go for it.
I think that there is a misunderstanding because I was the one that highlighted individualism. And I will respond to the young gentleman because in the end, the liberal democracy has gone to an extreme where the individual is so self-centered that you end up in this consumerism. This is the individual. And what I have said never dismiss the group. The thing is that the balance between the individual and the group is one, and I wouldn't say that this is particularly, but it's clear that the Confucian philosophy has a balance between the group and the individual different from other philosophies that are at the base. And I personally think you're right. In Africa, the group is fundamental. I mean, the group makes the survival of the individual. But in terms of agency, and I go back to this word, agency, I think there is a reason to highlight this continuum between the individual and its deviated manifestations today. You are absolutely right. And the excessive manifestations of the primacy of the group over everything, which is dictatorship. I mean, dictatorship in essence. I leave it there.
Okay, Professor Attali, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think we need to invent something which is not north, south, not east, not west. We need to invent something which is different. The West is going to a wall, and the world will collapse with this model of development. And the South is trying now to join the North with the same model of development, which is going to be a catastrophe. Therefore, we have to invent something different, something using the best of both, but maybe doing something which is totally different from both. I have my own view of what is needed, which is to move from what I call the economy of death to economy of life, which means to stop using fossil fuels, to stop using sugar, artificial sugar, to stop extensive agriculture, and to move to renewable energy, to education, to health, to democracy, to culture, to recycling, which is a huge change, because as we speak, 55 or 60% of the world GDP is on economy of death, while it should not be more than 10%. It's a huge change.
What is the economy of death? I mean, how would you...
The whole of the use of fossil fuels, from mobility to textiles, whoever you have on your shoulders, this is economy of death. And we have to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And the key question is, will we get rid of it democratically or not? Will we be forced to do it because of climate or because of any reason? Or will we do it with the purpose of another model of development where we put health, education, culture, democracy, science, research as number one?
Yes,
this is the challenge.
And does that sound like what...
I oppose on this. I mean, I disagree. I think it's clear in the model. But what this is translating is that we, in particular with the European Union, we patronize. And let me take the example of Mauritania, Mozambique. The Germans go and buy Mozambican gas to do what? To do their electricity. But until now, no IFI, no agency, whatever, KWF or whatever development agency would contribute financing gas to power generation in Mozambique. So, yes, we have to go there, but we cannot just force our model of mature, developed, not growing in terms of population, societies with a slow economic growth to other and Mozambique is an example. Senegal is exactly the same example. I think that this is what, and I'm in COP. I was in COP. I would have loved to make a comment, but there is no time. But honestly, this is what the South Africa resents about us, patronizing, forcing models. No, I think that, yes, we have a common challenge for the well-being of the planet. I open a parenthesis. China has now contributed more to the gases than the European Union in total. So we have contributed. Africa has still 700+ million of inhabitants that do not have access to any electricity, and I think that I fully agree with the model. This is our objective. But when we do the granularity of the model and we go to the interlocutors, we cannot just go with our idea and force, which is what, among other issues, the European Union has been doing for years.
Yes, but one of the issues is that if you've got 700 million people without power, whose responsibility is it to fix that? And there has been a feeling that the West owes it to the South. That argument is often made. But it feels like, especially with the King's Atlantic Initiative and things like that, the South is starting to find ways to fix itself instead of asking the West to fix its past, what is left behind.
First, just one sentence on the 300 billion. This is not enough. We need a private investment. Private investment. For private investment, we need to create the risk conditions.
Yes.
And there, we need to move all the IFIs to just go into this area, and we need to
what is an IFI for those in the audience who don't know?
International financial institutions, including the EBRD. And we need to also move, and there are regional efforts that are being made, the countries to go into governance, because this is a shared responsibility, frankly.
So just because we only have a couple minutes left, we're going to go to this last question, and if you could introduce yourself.
Larichi, économiste du Maroc.
It is true that the South is plural. That is unquestionable. But let's stick to these concepts for the sake of the analysis. And this is to say that countries of the South are starting to play that emerging role in the redefinition and redesign of this new discourse and paradigm. But what really matters is the emergence of a new reality here, to the extent where we are moving from an old world to a new world. And as Mr. Attali rightly pointed out, actually the world is shuttling and stumbling between liberal economy, moving towards an authoritarian world, an interventionist world, and I mean, just the states are intervening more and more in the economy. So there are a couple of initiatives here and there that are announcing a start of this reality, or the kickoff of this reality. Let me quote this example. The membership of the African Union to the G20 has become a permanent member, and this is very important, during the Delhi summit in 2023. And this is a world forum and global forum with a specific agenda that really consists in the reform of world government institutions, fighting against poverty and achieving energy transitions. So here you are, a voice of the South that making its voice heard louder, that finally has the right to make its voice heard. Now, the challenge here, isn't it to really have this leadership emerge between several components of the South that were rightly reminded by the ambassador. But how? How to do this?
Right to point out that the South is being invited into global institutions like the G20. Minister Moines, is it enough, or what would you like to see next?
No, it definitely is not enough. And I think it goes to the point of the architecture not being fair at all levels, and of reform needed at all levels, from the World Bank to the G20 to how much equality you're seeing at the Security Council and the outcomes, and you see the outcomes not being. But I don't think that this is going to be created towards invitation, that the West is going to say, please, this is your place. So I don't expect the way for a bigger role to be on an invitation basis.
So the economic powerhouses of Africa and Latin America are going to have to demand a seat at the table or create their own table.
We need to organize ourselves, and there is so much power just by the sheer numbers that we are just leaving out, that if we were to actually, and in the past it has helped, and at that point in time, I think the movement of non-aligned countries had its purpose and it served it well. I think that it's time for a newer generation or a newer version. There's also the non-state actors that are now playing a key role, whether we like it or not, and acknowledging that and trying to bring them to the table rather than being on the side and probably exerting more influence than what we want it to be. So there is space to create this newer platform that takes into account these non-state actors, more of the civil society, the middle powers that have a bigger role to play in this newer future. But it will not be by invitation.
Thank you. Ambassador Halal, to you goes the last comment.
So I just want to answer the question of my dear sister from Economist. Je vais bifurquer en français. C'est vrai, l'Union africaine.
It's true, the African Union has been invited to join the G20. Before that, Africa was already on the agenda, or rather on the menu of the G20. And all of a sudden, the G20 just realized that it was time, and highly time, to invite the Africans, but without interference. They can eat, they can discuss, they can say whatever they want, but they cannot interfere on major decisions. And the Secretary General is a member of the G20. Well, did it really help to solve the problems of the world? No. The World Trade Organization is a member of the G20. Did it really help to upgrade to a fair level the issues of tariffs and barriers? No. The World Bank, because this is the global trend now. We're inviting Africa, but without giving it power, without giving it the capacity to participate on an equal footing to the decision-making process. And look at the World Bank. if they're asked to really identify the claims and needs of the Africans, they're not really able to say it. Therefore, we need a major reform of financial international institutions within the Security Council, with the possibility to contribute to make Africans' dream true and to involve them in the decision-making process. And I'd say that beyond international institutions, there is a current positive trend, and that is the return of international law. International law has been expressed and manifested by joining the General Council, and we had the request of decisions on Palestine, on Ukraine. Now, there's another question on survival of the Pacific Islands. Well, this is also very important. So the International Court of Justice is a return back to international law, and this is where the future lies, and this is where the future of the world lies: more democracy, more rule of state, and rule of law, and also respect of international law in other countries. Thank you.
They threatened walkout of all of the UN members from Africa, Latin America, the South writ large, and you can demand a seat on the Security Council and get change that way. But I'm sure you wouldn't comment on that here.
No.
With that, I want to invite everyone to have coffee next, and thank you so much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a short coffee break at the lounge area. His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 13th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, scheduled to take place from December 12 to 14, 2024, in Rabat, Morocco. This flagship event will convene over 400 distinguished leaders from the public and private sectors, civil society, international organizations, think tanks, and the media across the Atlantic Basin, fostering open and candid discussions on pivotal cross-regional and cross-sectoral challenges. This year's conference marks a significant evolution, transitioning from annual thematic focuses to a broader, more inclusive approach emphasizing the wider Atlantic space's core values and strategic importance. The agenda will delve into critical topics such as geoeconomics, regional security, democracy, migration, and the energy transition, with a particular emphasis on the African Atlantic region. Participants will engage in over 11 plenary sessions, interactive town halls, thematic breakout dinners, and intimate night owl sessions, all designed to encourage meaningful dialogue. The Atlantic Dialogues Emerging Leaders 2024 program will bring together more than 40 young changemakers across the Atlantic. These emerging leaders will participate in a tailored leadership, policy and networking program, fostering intergenerational dialogue and bridging generational and perception gaps. Building on the previous 12 editions, this 13th edition will be a platform conducive to navigating the complexities of the Atlantic region